Good morning. It's a joy for me to participate in the conference. The Lutheran Church, Comi and Kaiapó are partners of the Synodal Network of Education through the project Education for Solidarity and Peace. Our conference is taking place at the same time as the UN Conference on Climate Change, the COP26. We are hoping for important global political decisions to mitigate the climate emergence that affects the whole world. I would like to begin by bringing a word of hope that was proclaimed by a young Indigenous leader of the state of Rondônia in Brazil. On the first day of COP26, Shai Surui brought a denunciation about the immobility of global leaders vis-à-vis the advance of extractivism on indigenous lands in the Amazon. She denounced the inertia of heads of state, which results in brutal murders of indigenous people who try to protect the social biodiversity of the forest. And on the front line of the climate emergency, these global leaders should put at the center of the political decisions, should put at the center the indigenous peoples and listen to them about preservation, interculturality, social biodiversity, and good living. She also highlights her ancestrality by saying that with her family, with her indigenous community, she has learned to listen to the stars, to the moon, to the wind, the animals, and the trees. And she finished by saying that because the climate is warming up, the earth is saying that humankind has no longer time. And it's not in 2030 or in 2050, it is right now. Shai, the young Surui Brazilian indigenous person, planted seeds of hope, of hopes, of very courageous hopes. In Brazil, the indigenous population is constituted of approximately 900,000 persons who are self-declared indigenous. They represent 0.4% of the Brazilian population, and there are 305 speaking indigenous peoples and 247 different languages, according to Brazil's demographic census. The indigenous lands correspond to 13% of the Brazilian territory and represent 20% of the total area of rural properties in Brazil. About 90% of the demarcated lands are concentrated in the region of the so-called legal Amazon, which accounts for 48% of the indigenous population in Brazil. In other words, 52% of the Brazilian indigenous population occupies less than 2% of the demarcated lands in the northeast, midwest, southeast, and southern region of Brazil. Indigenous peoples that we call originary peoples, from a global perspective, face forms of violence and threat, both the institutional ones that have to do with the actions of governments, of the legislative power, also the judiciary, regarding social environmental questions in Brazil. In Brazil, indigenous peoples face conflicts generated by the actions of the agricultural and cattle raising sector, mining, gold digging, land grabbing, and lumber extraction. We have to deepen the intercultural dialogue so that our schools be spaces of support, of solidarity, and of closeness to the originary or native peoples. For this first talk, I have the joy, I'm glad to introduce Edson Kaiapó and Aline. Aline, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to pronounce correctly your name. Afterwards, please, you share it with us. Aline Ngring Batari Kaiapó. These two persons she belongs to the Mebengo Kaiapó peoples. They are activists of the indigenous movement. Aline is a writer, researcher and studies law. Edson is an environmentalist, a writer who got an award from UNESCO, PhD in history of education with a focus on indigenous school education. He's professor of indigenous history and indigenous school education at the Federal Institute of Bahia, and he is a professor accredited at the graduate studies program and teaching on ethnic racial relationships at the Federal University of Bahia. Edson and Aline are with us here in the room, and we're now going to hear her and him to their talk that will be broadcast in a video, and then we follow with our dialogue. Hello everyone, my name is Edson Kaiapó. I am of the Mebengo Cré people, and for me it's a great satisfaction to be participating in this important event at such a delicate, sensitive moment in the history of humankind. I'm here at the Culture Center Xangiru of the Pataxó people in the Coroa Vermelha village, a very beautiful space with a preserved river, many plants, and people conducting a intercultural dialogue, which there's a great need to talk about the interculturality, about the need of this dialogue at this moment of reconstruction of social-environmental relationships. It's important to talk about the need of fostering hope at this moment of crisis that assails humankind. So there is a crisis that in the beginning of this dialogue must deal with it. It is a crisis that is not hidden. It is obvious. And it is a crisis of health, because of the pandemic that affects all of us equally, and it's also a crisis of economic values, of social-environmental values. The earth is warming up. It is a crisis that has to do with an epidemic, with a historical pandemic, which is a pandemic called racism that affects our indigenous peoples particularly. So since the 16th century, we have suffered so much violence from the Brazilian state, from the Brazilian society, from the groups who are surrounding us. So it's necessary for us to think about all these issues, to conduct a dialogue about it, because we indigenous peoples are humans made out of flesh and bone. We're here in the present, we are not in the past, we are not frozen in the past, we are not mummies, right? And I am absolutely sure that facing the crisis in which the world is involved, indigenous peoples have a great importance in this dialogue of reconstruction. And this dialogue of reconstruction, I have no doubt about this, is an intercultural dialogue. This is a methodology that we should use, a respectful dialogue between the various forms of knowledge, and particularly the millennial forms of knowledge that indigenous people have built over time and tested in the laboratories within the forests, right? So we have a very clear situation, which is a situation of a balanced life in which the indigenous peoples are inserted. A balanced life, balance between people and environment. In this place where I am, and I'm with my feet on a sacred land, barefoot on a sacred ground. In this place I feel the smell of plants, I feel the smell of very intense life, I feel the smell of river, of clean water where there are fish, and of water that we use in our daily lives. You know, this whole discussion is a discussion that has to do with interculturality, because this indigenous wisdom must be the object of a dialogue within the schools, the universities, in order to think about another society that overcomes the extremely developed societies, such as São Paulo, for example, where there is a river called Tietê. There's no need to say much more about that. This is the showcase of national development, which is the city of São Paulo has a river called Tietê. I'm glad because I have a memory that I recently drank water at the source of the Tietê River in the city of Salislópolis, which is a mountainous region. I was within the park and I had the privilege to see that river Tietê at its source, and I could drink water from my hands in that river, which leads me to think that it is possible that Tietê River becomes something healthy. All we have to do is to respect life in all its dimensions. So it is a necessary dialogue also within the schools. The schools must no longer turn their backs on the diversity of the indigenous peoples. It should no longer turn their backs to the talk about the need to challenge this epistemicidal and ecocidal policy, a policy that is guided by an idea of development that destroys everything, and it wants to put everything at the service of human well-being. And because of this perspective, we have destroyed the forests, we have polluted the rivers, and have maltreated people. And so the school is a place where we should conduct this discussion in order to think about another society that overcomes this society of extreme crisis in which we are involved. People live in anguish. Young people, adolescents, and children talk about suicide. People are sad because of the high inflation rate or because of the global warming, which are so many things that threaten our happiness. And we can dialogue about all that within the school in order then to design a society of re-enchantment so that the anguish, these desires, this feeling of suicide, of depression, that this may go away and that society may live in fully with persons and with nature, with the forces that surround us. So we have to realize the importance of human and non-human life for all of us. We have to respect the trees as beings that have life, the rivers as beings that have life, and the other persons as beings who have life. The indigenous peoples have guided their life on earth according to this format, and unfortunately we have suffered historically a lot of prejudice, a lot of racism, a lot of ethnocide and epistemicide because of this way of thinking that is extremely connected to our spiritualities, right? So what maintains this balance within the indigenous societies? It is cosmologies, spiritualities that have to do exactly with the fact that we see in the environment where we are, we see the sacred forces that create and recreate all things. That's the reason of the importance of being concerned all the time with the well-being of the forests, of the rivers, of the mountains, of the air that we breathe. And this is the dialogue that we're going to conduct during this conversation of ours. Hello, my name is Aline, Kaiapó. I belong to the Memengokre people of the state of Parada, the powerful Aymara and Andean nation, and the Tupinambá people, which is a legacy that I got from my grandma Almira. I'd like to talk with you a little about the importance of the implementation of Act 11,645 in the schools at all levels, including and mainly in the universities. We have heard a lot, right, as activists and as indigenous persons who are on the forefront playing the role of educators. We hear a lot about one issue. We didn't have education. We didn't have training. The university never taught us about indigenous people. So we heard this from in all different courses. And the importance of this, the implementation of this law, and this law really cannot be seen as merely a formal law. In other words, a law that is only on paper. And when I talk about a law on paper, this refers me to a memory of the father of Aldelice Verão when he said the following words: "My daughter, you must be at the university for you to make the paper talk." There was already this concern about this disparity of the indigenous people and positivism and the law that is there stuck on paper. And what would be then our role in this situation to make the paper talk? Imagine how much work this would cause. Imagine the work that it is causing to make paper talk. And when I talk about the Act 11,645, the importance of its implementation, it's precisely to contribute to our work, because see, it is not important only for the indigenous peoples to be in the schools, be they indigenous or non-indigenous peoples, or in the university. It's important that the Brazilian state promotes public policies to encourage the permanence of these people within the university. And when I talk about encouragement, I cannot expect this only from the state. I must also make sure that the non-indigenous population, society, the surrounding community understands the importance of the indigenous peoples For them to be indigenous, also respect the dignity of their bodies in that place. Because when we are in those places, we are not only indigenous persons, we carry a whole ancestry. And beyond that, we are, our body there is the extension of our territory, right? I'm a founding member of a movement called Aracunas, Brazil, and in this movement we discuss a lot about this, about the dignity of our bodies as extensions of our territory. And regarding this, it's important to highlight that we indigenous peoples, when we engage in these debates, in these dialogues, we want to engage in this dialogue in order to talk about this re-enchantment. We are not pulling the responsibility only towards us, because all of us have an ancestrality. What happens is that in the course of history, they forced us to understand, or forced the majority of people to understand, that they are human beings, right? And nature is apart from human beings. And as we grow up, we produce a scientific knowledge on those foundations where you are the human being at the center of everything. The ancestral worldviews and epistemologies are completely diminished, and you are separate from nature. So what do we have? We have a sense that produces and moves towards chaos. And this is not what we are proposing. The state has always accused us of being a backward force for the nation. Why? Because we are against development. I would like to tell you, dear colleagues, that we are actually and will continue to be against development, because our proposal is a proposal of involvement. We will never be integrated. We will never be able, as activists, as long as there is strength on this Pachamama earth, we will never allow our children give up their ancestrality. We will never allow this. We are in favor of involvement. We will never allow our children to be integrated into this national state that makes humankind as a whole to move towards the brink of abyss, towards chaos. We have also raised a proposal, because even the critique is not an isolated word. The critique is a movement, and even an intellectual movement. And the critique must bring proposals. So what is our proposal? It's the proposal of interaction. We must work on interaction, and working on interaction means respecting the epistemologies, both the non-indigenous ones, and also to respect that this must be a two-way street. That non-indigenous knowledge and persons that produce scientific knowledge should also respect our ancestral epistemologies, right? And how are we going to do that? By interacting among ourselves. This is what we propose. And a very important thing that you should not fail to highlight is that this task of enchanting relationships, of bringing hope, both for science and for all relationships, both at universities and in the most diverse spaces of national society, it can only take place when we all are interacting among ourselves. Because this responsibility is not only of the indigenous people, it's a responsibility of all those who have an ancestral memory. Pachamama is not the mother of the indigenous people, it's the mother of all of us, black people, indigenous people, and white people. So the task of the school, I believe that first of all, would be to make this conciliation, this reconciliation between human beings, right, and nature, because we are nature. And on that basis, certainly the children, the adolescents, and the adults are going to grow up with a new view, not this utilitaristic view that we should plant trees because of the heat, that we should no longer throw garbage in the river because we take our water from them. But we should respect being in itself, because that river is a living being. That tree is a living being. And in the streets, everything that surrounds us possesses life, and we must respect that. And we should live in a respectful manner in communion with the environment, because we are nature. Thank you. Now, talking about all these issues of crisis and violence that assail our peoples, and to thinking about hope, about fostering hope, and about education as a space to foster hope is not a very tranquil exercise, but the educators must be very attentive to it. So at this moment, as we are here talking about fostering hope, the Brazilian state is put to the vote the so-called temporal frame, which is a thesis that suspends the demarcation of the originary territories of the indigenous peoples, and at the same time makes these territories available for agribusiness, for the large land estates. So at the moment when humankind is beginning to understand the need to preserve the ecosystems and biomes, the Brazilian state is saying that these ecosystems and biomes can be destroyed in the name of progress, right? So this agenda, this issue of the temporal frame of the demarcation of territories and demarcation of territories for the well-being of the indigenous peoples and of humankind as a whole is an agenda that must be within the schools. The teachers must become aware of this discussion, and then people can no longer say that they don't have information about this, because look, we have, for example, the Social Environmental Institute and its site that presents this debate very well. But before this Social Environmental Institute, I have to mention the articulation of indigenous peoples in Brazil, that has a very well organized website with a lot of information about these debates and about, for instance, of the burden that the pandemic of COVID-19 has meant on the indigenous people. So it's necessary that people and the educators particularly become aware of this debate and conduct this discussion within the schools. Also, in order to enforce the law 11,645 of 2008 that talks about the Mediterranean teaching and Afro-Brazilian indigenous history and culture in the schools. So if you consider that intercultural dialogue is the methodology to overcome the crisis, obviously we are saying that we are willing to have a dialogue with indigenous peoples. And in order to conduct the dialogue with indigenous peoples, we must have this basic knowledge in our hands about what is going on at this moment. How many indigenous peoples there are, how many languages these peoples speak, where these peoples are, what are the main challenges of these peoples at present, right? So these issues must be raised, and even these issues must be raised in a protagonistic manner, which means that indigenous leaders and representatives must be in the schools and in the universities in order to conduct this debate. This guarantee must be very well established. And another place that I would say is a place for excellence to conduct this dialogue is the indigenous literature, the literature produced by indigenous writers. So today we have, I would say, a great army of indigenous people writing, publishing about their cosmologies and spiritualities, about the challenges of our peoples, about our worldviews. Just to mention a few of these writers, and I remember here the pioneers Aline, Daniel Munduruku, Ailton Krenak, Kaká Verá, Olívio Jacopé, Graça Garaúna, Aline Kaiapó, Carcaju Pataxó, Edson Kaiapó, and a large and a growing group, just to mention a few of them. So there is a bookstore, an online bookstore specialized in indigenous literature, which is the Maracá bookstore. People can consult it, and there they will have access to this whole discussion about all these worldviews of the indigenous peoples. Worldviews that can give a good contribution to this project of reconstruction of everything that is being destroyed. A project for an intercultural dialogue of these forms of knowledge, of our peoples, of our epistemologies, that are connected, tied to these other forms of knowledge, right? The forms of knowledge that are built within the academias and research centers in such a way that for me it is very obvious that these two forms of knowledge must have a conversation on equal footing in favor of humankind as a whole, and particularly in favor of the society projects of our peoples, indigenous peoples. And here I am with my feet on the ground to tell you that this crisis that humankind is facing is no novelty for us indigenous peoples. Since the 16th century, we have faced epidemics programmed against our peoples. We have seen a lot of violence and expropriation of our territories. We have faced the accusation that our spiritualities are connected to the demon, are connected to the inferior forces. And I've seen, for example, that in the 16th century, high-ranking officers of the Portuguese crown used to say that our peoples had no faith, had no law, and had no king. and so many fallacies that finally they produced the decrees on just war against our peoples, just war against those who did not accept the Christian faith and did not accept the orders of the Portuguese crown of a genocidal, epistemicidal, ethnocidal, and ecocidal policy that does not stop, right? And there we have then, from the historical point of view, the independence of Brazil was proclaimed in 1822, and there was no change for us indigenous peoples, and for other populations too. So the structure continued to be extremely agrarian and based on large land estates. The slavery remained as a burden on our peoples, also on our peoples, and the genocide continued. And at the end of the 19th century, the great intellectuals, the great thinkers in Brazil at that time already said that the extinction was certain. Our people would be extinguished due to their inability to keep up with the national progress. Francisco van Hagen, who was one of the most illustrious thinkers of the 19th century, theorized and wrote about this theory of the inevitable extinction or extermination. From a little point of view, we had romanticism of a writer like José de Alencar, transforming our forebears into extremely docile people who had showed no resistance against the violence of the colonizers. And ultimately, the death was sure. Iracema, the indigenous woman, died out of passion for colonizers. So everything indicated, even the laws, made our peoples disappear. So everything indicated that there was an established path of extinction. And this was reflected in the schools. At the end of the 19th century, the schools taught that we indigenous peoples belong to the past, that we were frozen, therefore, in the 16th or 17th century, and that we were people that left us a few legacies, which is exactly what the schools teach today. They teach on the 19th of April that indigenous peoples left some legacies, and among these legacies is the liking for fried fish, the liking for eating flour, the liking for sleeping on hammocks, and so many other things that are presented as if we were not peoples made out of bone and flesh in the present. From the point of view of the state, what we see is the main desire to maintain the policy of tutelage created by the Service of Protection of the Indians and later by FUNAI, a government agency that identified our peoples as inferior from a biological point of view, as incapable. And according to them, it was a state's task to transform us into Brazilians, which meant we'll no longer be Indians, we will no longer be indigenous people with our social linguistic diversity. So unfortunately what we have seen then, from a practical point of view, that in the schools the teachers continue fearlessly speaking and teaching about the generalization of peoples. The diversity is not presented, but rather the indigenous or Indians in a generic sense, and even say that every indigenous person worships Tupã, and every indigenous person speaks Tupi. So there is a lot of representations that definitely are not part of our social linguistic diversity. So the school must reconceive of its path. Even from the pedagogical point of view, it's no longer sustainable to have a school that lives around the idea of passing and flunking. The school can and must be much more than passing and flunking. The school can and should be a space of teaching and learning, of broadening our minds, our ideas, in the sense of respecting the other, of respecting life, of respecting nature, respecting, everything that surrounds us. And we should realize the need to overcome the crisis in which we are caught, right? The adolescents and children can no longer be maintain themselves in the place of the wish for suicide, in depression, in anguish. We human beings are capable, and we have to create, produce, and build another path that overcomes all this violence, that overcomes all this violent form of being in society that is even reproduced by the schools to a great extent. So we educators have the duty to collaborate, to contribute to the construction of this different society. And this is not for a far future, no, it's a society for right away. We certainly are going to get out of this moment of pandemic, and we must think about this different society, a set of respect for people, of rupture with racist actions, with epistemicidal and genocidal actions. We can no longer condone this. The school must be the space of respect, and the school must be the place for us to rethink, reconceive, to think about this other society where people have the right to learn about the things that surround us, right? We have to learn how to learn with the forces of nature. We cannot keep ourselves in the role of those who decree a war against the earth. And we have decreed war for the water, for the soil, for the subsoil, for the air. And the earth can no longer bear this. The earth no longer bears human beings making such a mess. And the earth is about to give grade 0 to all of us. And in seconds it can transform all of us into cosmic dust. Therefore, let us not deceive ourselves and think that we can save the earth, that we should save the earth. We don't need to save the earth. We need to guarantee to the future generations, because the earth is sufficiently powerful to react against all this violence that we have done to it. Therefore, I would like to conclude this talk by saying that we must take on this political commitment for transformation. As educators, we must take on this role of conducting or of contributing in the conduction of dialogue for the re-enchantment of social and environmental relationships. We have to see the importance of things, of trees, of rivers, of the air, of mountains, of persons, and of everything that surrounds us. I am absolutely sure that we are capable of doing that, and I am absolutely sure that the school can be and must be the place of hope, the place of fostering hope. So then we will be able to certainly envision ahead of us the society that we want, which is a society of respect to the social linguistic diversities of peoples, of spiritual, cosmological diversity of peoples, and we can and must join hands to rebuild everything that was destroyed in the name of progress. And I am absolutely sure that the school is a primary space to perform this reconstruction. Thank you very much, and I wish the best for all of us. Edson and Aline, thank you for the contents that you brought that make us move in hope, and which are also conceptual and loving provocations for the school to think about itself as a social territory, right, of forms of learning, of transformations, of respect, as you said. Thinking about the construction of another society based on the social environmental re-enchantments that you stressed in this intercultural and contextual analysis of the indigenous peoples and of their enormous contribution to about their protagonistic role, about their presence in different territories. We thank you a lot. We have here a comment on our chat by Celinira. She thanks very much, Aline, for your talk. She also said that we are here united in the causes of the indigenous and Afro-Brazilian peoples, seeking their rights through the implementation of the laws 10,639 and 11,645. She says that the challenges are great and that the nature is part of the indigenous and Afro-Brazilian holy, that we should have faith and hope to move ahead. Anika also thanks a lot. Valdomiro thanks a lot, Edson and Aline. Someone is saying that the schools must be places of hope. So we have here Aline and Edson with us to complement or also to address our community here and reinforce maybe their talks and maybe add a few elements. Hello, good morning everyone. Are you okay? We are here, me and Aline Kaiapó. What I wanted to say, first of all, is to thank for the opportunity of being here, carrying out this dialogue. We are very glad for the invitation. It's always a great joy for us to have this conversation because, after all, it is actually very necessary to think in terms, or to think about actions in terms of fostering hope. It's time of fostering hope. We've seen enough of anguish, sadness, crisis, pandemic problems. So it's a time for us to raise, to move on and design a different society, a society of respect. A society in which people respect each other, respect not only each other in their ways of thinking, their ways of organization, but also as a moment of respect towards life as a whole. Because often within our perspective of very rooted anthropocentrism, we think only about respect in relation to persons. This is doubtless necessary. Respecting people is fundamental. Children, adolescents, young people, adults, the elderly. But it's also important, likewise, to respect the rivers, the waters, the trees, the animals, the mountains. So for us to get out of the situation in which we find ourselves, of so many difficulties, I have no doubt that respect is fundamental. And this movement of respect, of building this respect, certainly to a great extent will take place and can take place through the educational process, particularly of indigenous education, of school education within the schools, within the classrooms. So we educators, we must act, right? We have to get organized to act along these lines within the classrooms and to raise this debate. We should demystify many myths that are implanted into people's minds, like, for example, this thing about the inferiority of the indigenous peoples, of their traditions, or about the inferiority of the animals and the trees vis-a-vis human beings. It's necessary for us to think and learn to think and act in a way that we then have the understanding that we are equals, indigenous people, black people, peoples, persons of different nationalities. We have common characteristics, which is the fact of being human beings, of being also rational. And within these human and rational characteristics, it's up to all of us, regardless of our ethnic, racial origin, we should respect people, human life and non-human life. I give the floor to Aline now. I thank you for being here with you. It is a very special opportunity for me because I did have a Christian origin, and I saw myself often caught in a cage because I could not often demonstrate my spirituality, right? And I could not make something genuine, even for God, because always the church has always demonized our practices. So now to be here talking with Christian persons, pastors, people who are getting involved in this new form of relationship, breaking with the past of pain and trying to make changes so that the new generations of pastors know how to deal with indigenous peoples without hurting the dignity of human persons, of the indigenous persons, is very gratifying to me. I am really thankful for that, for this moment, and for us to be able to be here talking not only about spiritual issues, but also practical issues. Because our spirituality, it has to take larger steps. Actually, our practices are non-material practices. They must take larger steps in the spiritual world. I believe then it's no use to talk and one thing and do other things. There's no use in doing things and do other things. Also, not to talk the walk. So if we walk on a straight path and if we don't swerve neither to the left nor to the right, we should rather value what we speak so that what we say corresponds to our actions. Because as the Word of God says, word convinces, but the witness literally drags people. So may our mission, in fact, be conveyed through our acts, and that these acts should not hurt the traditional peoples. We are no longer being able to conceive of a relationship of respect with Protestantism within the indigenous lands, because we are tired of seeing that when missions or churches get into our territories, they literally hurt the dignity of our peoples. So this is a thing that is overwhelming for us, right? But when we have a people that is not concerned with demonizing, but with proposing rather than imposing a new reality, yes, then I totally agree with it, because we are free for our most diverse spiritual manifestations. So I thank you very much for you, for the fact that you are dealing with this, also with the topic of the Mediterraneanness of that teaching in schools. For us, this is very important. Aline and Edson, there is a question here for you, and many words of thanks too. Birgit is here thanking a lot. She's saying that it is necessary, yes, to have an evident global position about respect for life, right? Danielle is saying also that this period here of the pandemic of COVID-19, and that principals and teachers of schools should get prepared and should get training to face the consequences of the coronavirus. He speaks also about the importance of international meetings like this one, in which there is an exchange of ideas and experiences. They coincide exactly with this situation, because the world is always moving towards changes, right? And principles also of Protestant schools, institutions and churches must also act along these lines, right? Now, the question I'm going to bring, actually, I'm going to bring two questions. I'm trying to systematize them. There is a question about what is exactly, in your review, what are the central problems with the notion of development? Now, what model of development is the one that best defines this process, this whole process of the exploitation of the resources of the earth, and also the negation, denial of human life? Is there another form of possible form of development? Here there is a question by James. You just mentioned your experiences with Christianity, Aline, and he's interested in knowing a little more also about whether there's some part of the Bible that inspires you most, whether there's some story of Jesus that was important to you. Let me see here. And she's also asking if you have the support of organizations that work with translations, and it also helps to protect and preserve the originary languages of the indigenous communities. So you have now a short time to answer these questions. And these questions. Now, Johnny, you should also guide us and tell us where we stand in terms of time. So we have 5 minutes left and we can continue. Hello, are you hearing me? So, my experience with Christianity began in my childhood already, because I attended an Adventist school, and my family was very much like this. So the people, they may have various religions, but they always say that they are Catholic. So they say, oh, I'm Catholic. You can be an adherent of the Umbanda religion or a spiritual, you may be a spiritualist, but people always say that they are Catholics. Other than the Protestants who don't say I'm a Catholic. So when I went to this Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist school, I got used to say, no, I'm not Catholic. And although I had never had any kind of contact with the Catholic doctrine, besides the common knowledge that is reproduced on a daily basis through commemorative dates or something along these lines. But have always had, since I was a child, so I attended the kindergarten in this Adventist school until the third year of the high school. So you can see that I have a long journey, and this path, my path in the Adventist schools and in the Protestant Christian doctrine. And then I left. I never belonged to the Adventist religion, but I did study there, and I drank at the source of the Adventist teachings during many years of my life. And when I came of age, I joined a church, a congregation, a Protestant congregation also, but not an Adventist one. And I became a leader within the church. So that this spirituality of ours, our ancestrality, it is not embarrassed about how it is going to be demonstrated. So, how can I explain that? My ancestrality was talking very loudly. So I needed to have a freedom within my religion in order to express this. So I was no longer being able to pray in the status quo of that kind of behavior, where you have that stage, where you have chairs, where you have... Like, I wanted it to be something else. I wanted the church to be around, that the meetings took place with the sitting on the floor. I thought about rituals of fire. I thought about various things. And when I began to express these wishes, I saw that there is no space within that body. And then you end up feeling hurt, sad, and you end up going away for this reason, and you experiment with other forms, because our spirituality must manifest itself. We are beings who believe in an ancestrality, just like the Jews, for example, who honor their ancestrals, their forebears. We too do that. But when we talk about indigenous people, this seems to becomes very obvious, and people have difficulty to understand this. So this was grosso modo my connection. Yes, there are parts of the Bible that I like very much. I like very much Paul's letters and teachings. I like it when he says that he knows how to live with scarcity and in abundance, and I will carry that with me. Particularly in this society, it is an extremely capitalist society where your worth depends on what you have, not on what you are, on your potential. So when I don't have, when my granaries are not full, in spite of that, we are thankful, right? We are not defeated by the adversities of circumstances. Because if it were so, we would not be resistant indigenous peoples, right? That we are surviving for centuries and showing our existence through our resistance. Thank you. Yes. Very good is Aline's talk, but I would like to make a few additions in relation to the question of this project of development that devastates everything. It is a human project that is highly individualistic, highly anthropocentric, because a project of human development is guided by the anthropocentrism that was worked out in the 18th century by the Enlightenment, that determined that the human beings are rational, and this rationality put them above all other forms of life and of everything that surrounds us. And it's up to us as rational beings to put everything at our service, to dominate and put everything at our service. This project devastated the human and social relationships, the water sources, the forests. So we should revise all of that. And in this sense, I think that the proposal that was mentioned by Aline in her initial talk is the proposal of involvement, right? We should replace, because development means disinvolvement. So this D is a prefix of negation. It means a non-involvement. So we indigenous peoples have proposed involvement. We should get involved with persons and with trees and animals and rivers and the mountains. And if we implement this perspective of involvements, we certainly will put a stop to so much violence, so much racism, so much discrimination, so much prejudice, and so much ecocide. And so the school must be and can be an agency
ensinar.
where we can teach and learn this practice of involvement.
E com relação,
And as far as the partner agencies are concerned,
não vou me alongar,
I'm not going to talk very long because I know that our time is short, but look, the CIMI,
o CIM,
the Catholic Council for Indigenous Mission, has been a great partner in our articulations and projects in the indigenous communities. And the Lutheran Foundation of Diaconia itself has been an excellent partner through Cassiani. She has been with us all the time, through COMIN, the Indigenous Council for Mission Among Indigenous People. So we have carried out and followed many projects through COMIN. And we also have partners of the Social Environmental Institute and with many international institutions. So it should be very clear that this complaint that we have about a certain type of Christianity is obviously not a generalization. We complain about the Christianity that does not respect us. But we have here a very obvious example. We have here a very beautiful international live meeting being where the indigenous people play a leading role, talking about their histories, their memories, their cosmologies. So I must not say that this is a space of respect, right? This is very obvious. But not all our Christian brothers and sisters act in this way, unfortunately. They also learn how to deal with these diversities and differences and respect all of that.
passa a palavra.
I give the floor back.
Muito obrigada, Aline.
Thank you, Aline and Edson.
Ficam aqui muito.
Now, what remains here is a lot of contents that echo as seeds of hope. What remains here is also a very assertive and central pedagogical proposal, which is the methodology of overcoming the crisis and intercultural dialogue. So, thank you very much. But we're going afterwards to continue the debate in the work groups. So, and now I give the floor back to Johnny and Miguel.